In 1911, the United States Supreme Court did something it had never done before. It took the second largest corporation in American history and shattered it into 34 separate pieces. The company? Standard Oil. The man behind it? John D. Rockefeller, who, despite losing his empire, would become the richest person in modern history. But here's what they don't tell you in school. Rockefeller didn't just build a company, he invented an entirely new way to destroy competition, a method so effective, so ruthless, that it would change American capitalism forever. This is the story of how one man turned a chaotic industry into his personal kingdom, and why it took the full power of the federal government to stop him. To understand how Rockefeller built his monopoly, you need to understand what America looked like before he arrived. The year is 1859. Colonel Edwin Drake has just struck oil in Titusville, Pennsylvania. It's the first commercial oil well in the United States, and it's about to trigger an economic gold rush that makes California look tame. But here's the thing. Oil in 1859 wasn't used for cars. There were no cars. It wasn't even used for electricity. There was barely any electricity. Oil had one primary purpose: kerosene for lamps. And America desperately needed it. Before kerosene, people lit their homes with whale oil, which was expensive and getting scarcer as whale populations declined. Kerosene was the miracle fuel that would light up the night for ordinary families. Within months of Drake's discovery, prospectors swarmed Pennsylvania. Oil fields popped up everywhere. Derricks covered the landscape like a forest of wooden towers. Towns appeared overnight. Fortunes were made and lost in days. It was complete chaos. The oil business in the 1860s was anarchic. Prices swung wildly. One week, oil barrels sold for $10. The next week, 10 cents. Producers drilled wherever they wanted. Refineries sprang up in every town. Middlemen and speculators multiplied like weeds. Everyone was making money hand over fist and losing it just as fast. In 1863, a 24-year-old bookkeeper looked at the chaos of the oil industry and saw something nobody else did: opportunity through order. John Davidson Rockefeller wasn't a prospector. He wasn't a wildcatter drilling for black gold. He was, by all accounts, the most boring young man you'd ever meet. Rockefeller kept meticulous records of every penny. He was a devout Baptist who didn't drink, didn't smoke, and lived modestly despite his growing wealth. His idea of excitement was balancing ledgers and attending church. But beneath that bland exterior was one of the most ruthless business minds in American history. Rockefeller noticed something crucial. Drilling for oil was a gamble. You might strike it rich, or you might get nothing. The real, consistent money wasn't in finding oil, it was in refining it. In 1863, he invested $4,000 in a Cleveland refinery. Within 2 years, he bought out his partners and made it his sole focus. He called the operation Standard Oil. The name was deliberately chosen. In an industry defined by chaos and inconsistency, Rockefeller promised one thing: a standard product every time. But Rockefeller had a secret weapon that went far beyond quality control. He understood something about capitalism that most of his competitors didn't. In a cutthroat industry, the person who controls costs wins everything. Here's where Rockefeller's genius and ruthlessness became clear. While his competitors focused on refining more oil, Rockefeller became obsessed with efficiency. And I mean obsessed. He hired chemists to extract every possible byproduct from crude oil. While other refineries threw away gasoline as a useless byproduct, Rockefeller stored it. He found uses for paraffin wax, petroleum jelly, lubricants, even paint and chewing gum. His refineries used every drop. Competitors wasted 40% of each barrel. Rockefeller wasted almost nothing. He bought his own timber to make his own barrels. When he calculated that barrels needed 40 drops of solder and his workers used 39 drops, the barrels leaked. When they used 38 drops, they held. He saved a fraction of a cent per barrel, but when you're making thousands of barrels per day, those fractions become fortunes. But the real genius move came next. Rockefeller went to the railroads. In the 1870s, railroads were the only way to transport oil. Rockefeller walked into railroad offices with a proposal. I'll give you all of Standard Oil's shipping business, thousands of barrels per day, guaranteed, if you give me a discount. The railroads agreed. Rockefeller got rates 50% cheaper than his competitors. But then, Rockefeller made a demand that would change everything. He didn't just want his own discount. He wanted the railroads to pay him a rebate on every barrel his competitors shipped. Read that again. Rockefeller got paid every time his competitors used the railroad. His competitors were literally funding Standard Oil's expansion with every barrel they shipped. By the early 1870s, Rockefeller controlled about 10% of American oil refining. Within 5 years, he'd control 90%. Here's how he did it. Armed with his railroad rebates and superior efficiency, Rockefeller could undercut any competitor on price. When a rival refinery in a city refused to sell to him, Rockefeller would slash his prices in that market and that market alone, selling kerosene below cost until the competitor bled money. Meanwhile, Standard Oil's profits in every other market subsidized these local price wars. The competitor had two choices: sell to Rockefeller at whatever price he offered or go bankrupt. Most sold. Between 1872 and 1879, Rockefeller acquired 22 of his 26 competitors in Cleveland. Then he expanded to Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, New York. But Rockefeller had a particular method that made him especially dangerous. When he bought a competitor, he often kept the company's name and management in place. To the outside world, it looked like independent businesses. In reality, they were all Standard Oil. A shopkeeper in Philadelphia might think he was choosing between 3 different kerosene suppliers. He didn't know all 3 were Rockefeller. Even more devious, Rockefeller's acquired companies would suddenly become more competitive against Standard Oil's remaining rivals. They'd get those same railroad rebates. They'd coordinate their price cuts. Independent refiners found themselves competing against what seemed like a dozen companies, but was actually one massive, invisible octopus. By the 1879, Rockefeller controlled roughly 90% of oil refining in the United States, but he wasn't done. Controlling refining wasn't enough for Rockefeller. He wanted to control the entire supply chain, from the oil well to the consumer's lamp. He began buying pipelines, cutting out the railroads. He purchased tank cars and warehouses. He bought oil fields. He even acquired the companies that made railroad tank cars. This strategy, controlling every step of production, is called vertical integration. Rockefeller didn't invent it, but he perfected it. By the 1880s, if you used kerosene in America, you were almost certainly giving money to Standard Oil, whether you knew it or not. But there was a problem. Trusts, which is what Rockefeller's network of secretly controlled companies was called, weren't clearly legal. So in 1882, Rockefeller's lawyers invented something new: the Standard Oil Trust. This legal structure allowed Rockefeller to manage all his companies from a central board while maintaining the appearance of separate entities. It was brilliant. It was innovative. It was also going to destroy him. By the 1880s, Americans were waking up to what Rockefeller had done. Journalists began calling Standard Oil the octopus. Cartoons showed Rockefeller as a greedy titan strangling the nation. Ida Tarbell, whose father had been driven out of the oil business by Standard Oil, wrote a devastating series of articles exposing Rockefeller's methods. The public was outraged. This wasn't capitalism, it was monopoly. One man controlled an entire industry that touched every American home. State governments began investigating. In 1910, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, the first federal law to limit monopolies. But Rockefeller had the best lawyers money could buy. Standard Oil reorganized, adapted, delayed. For 2 decades, the company fought legal battles while continuing to dominate the oil industry. Then, in 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt decided enough was enough. Roosevelt was a trust buster. He'd already taken on J.P. Morgan and the railroads. Now he set his sights on the biggest trust of all. The federal government sued Standard Oil for violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. The trial lasted for years. The evidence was overwhelming. Secret rebates, predatory pricing, market manipulation, industrial espionage. Standard Oil had done it all. Finally, on May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously Standard Oil was an illegal monopoly and must be dissolved. The Supreme Court broke Standard Oil into 34 separate companies. Each would operate independently, competing against one another. You might know some of them. Standard Oil of New Jersey became Exxon. Standard Oil of New York became Mobil. Standard Oil of California became Chevron. Standard Oil of Indiana became Amoco. Standard Oil of Ohio became BP America. The breakup of Standard Oil created the modern American oil industry. But here's the twist that Rockefeller must have appreciated. The breakup made him even richer. When Standard Oil split into 34 separate companies, Rockefeller owned shares in all of them. As separate, competing entities, their total value actually increased. Within a few years, Rockefeller's wealth had nearly doubled. By the time he died in 1937, at age 97, his fortune was estimated at $1.4 billion, or about $340 billion in today's money, making him likely the richest person in modern history. But his legacy is complicated. Rockefeller was undoubtedly ruthless. He crushed competitors, manipulated markets, and corrupted the political system. His business practices were so predatory that America had to invent new laws to stop him. Yet, Rockefeller also brought stability to a chaotic industry. Standard Oil's kerosene was higher quality and cheaper than most competitors. The company invested in research and innovation. Rockefeller himself gave away more than $500 million to charity, funding universities, medical research, and the eradication of hookworm in the American South. Was he a robber baron or an industrial visionary, a ruthless monopolist or an efficient businessman in a rough era? The answer, as always, is complicated. Today, we live in a world shaped by Rockefeller's legacy. The antitrust laws created to stop him still govern American business. The oil companies formed from Standard Oil's breakup still dominate global energy. The philanthropic foundations he created still fund research and education. And the debate over his legacy continues. In an age of Amazon, Google, and Apple, companies that dominate their industries just as thoroughly as Standard Oil once did, we're asking the same questions. When does success become monopoly? When does efficiency become predation? Where do we draw the line between the ambition that drives capitalism and the concentration of power that threatens it? John D. Rockefeller never answered those questions. He just played the game better than anyone else ever had. And in doing so, he changed the rules forever. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Standard Oil, check out our documentary on J.P. Morgan and the creation of America's banking system. And let me know in the comments, was Rockefeller a visionary or a villain? Don't forget to subscribe for more history documentaries every week.